Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's wonderful to see so many people, real people in the room. So thank you very much for coming. So first of all, my name is Kylie. I'm a lecturer in IDB, for those of you who haven't met. So I'm the convener of the research seminar series. So today, we are delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Haley Sweetland, who traveled from the Netherlands, the University of Radboud. Thank you. Thank you very much. Haley corrected me earlier. I was like, I really need to make sure this is correct. So Haley is associate professor in the Department of Political Science, Center for International Conflicts Analysis and Management. And then her research focused on, I'm sure that many of you would have been familiar with her work, that focused on international actors in the global south. And she's the author of the book, The Development Dance, How Donors and Recipients Negotiate Foreign Aid, published by Cornell University Press in 2017. And also she has published widely in international renowned journals, including African Affairs, Review of International Political Economy, International Affairs, and European Journal of International Relations. So today we're delighted to have Haley to share with us her paper on Do Citizens Reward Public Institutions for Increased Transparency? Evidence from Bilateral Aid Agencies. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carly. So yeah, it is also very nice to be doing this in person instead of a screen. A couple of things before I introduce the project and the paper more specifically. I think it's always nice to just tell you what stage this paper is at. So we have a working draft of this paper. So we've collected the empirical analysis and ran the analysis, but we're really still at the draft phase. So we are very much open to your comments and suggestions and hoping to help refine the project. We're particularly interested, you might have noticed from the title, right, we have evidence from bilateral aid agencies. With this particular paper, it's part of a larger project on aid transparency, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But in this paper, we'd like to target at a broader audience. So we'd like to target it at more of an IR or general interest political science journal, and using kind of development agencies as an illustrative case. So if there are suggestions also on the framing and kind of how to make that argument and sell that, we'd also particularly appreciate those suggestions. So as the introduction kind of suggested, a lot of my work has really been on bargaining and negotiation, and that's specifically focused at the mission level. So in this way, this project is very different. I'm talking about donor agencies. I'm using survey experiments, not qualitative research, with a UK sample. So it's a different project for me, but for me, the kind of thing that's really interesting about it is that in a lot of my work, I've been interested in the role of organizational politics in development and in IR in general. And I think when practitioners and people who work in the development space realize that organizational politics and the individuals that work for these organizations really powerfully affect the way we implement development, but we don't always have the theory to talk about that. And so this project really narrows in on one aspect, and that's aid transparency, and its relationship specifically with public opinion. The project is, so the paper is a co-authored paper with Myrtle Hensel and Bernard Riesberg, both with the University of Glasgow. It's part of a larger project with Bernard that we began in 2020, the title Organizing for Development, that has two kind of major empirical components. So Nijmegen, so Radboud and Glasgow have this special relationship, which basically means that there are some small pools of seed money that we can access in order to fund research. So Bernard and I got together and thought, okay, what are some interesting things we can work on? And what we did as kind of as the major empirical part is we created what we call the Citizen Aid Transparency data set. So this is a large data set in which we measure the transparency of 212 bilateral aid agencies by coding their website. And we measure them across 120 different variables. So we had a huge student team from both Glasgow and Radboud that was involved in this coding. And we think that the CAD is really useful in kind of three ways. So you're probably aware that there are existing measures of aid transparency. So most prominently, the ATI, the Aid Transparency Index. What our index or our data set does that's different is that we really want to focus on what aid agencies reveal to citizens. So if you take a look at the ATI, what they're measuring, so the primarily way that the ATI or Publish What You Fund measures whether an aid agency is transparent is how much they report to the IATI, right? So this international data set. Previous aid transparency indexes measured how much was being reported to the OECD DAC. So we think that these measurements, those indexes are really measuring how much donors provide to global audiences, to international audiences. But that's not actually consistent with what theories on transparency say, which are really about what can citizens actually access. So we thought, okay, let's actually code websites, right? So if you're a citizen or if you're an advocacy organization and you go to your agency's website, what information can you actually find about your agency? And what we actually find is that the data set is not highly correlated with the ATI, which suggests that we're measuring something different. We measure, we have a larger coverage, right? So the ATI measures about 50 bilateral aid agencies because it mainly focuses on major aid agencies. But what we did is we coded all aid agencies within 37 different donor countries. And what this allows us to do is also have some comparisons between within a donor country and not just between donor countries. And the reason why we have so many indicators is that there's 19 different main indicators related to aid practices and aid governance. But then we also code whether or not how accessible and how useful the data is. So we measure whether or not it was a PDF, whether or not it was HTML, whether or not it's machine readable. We measure how many clicks it takes to get to that particular piece of information. For the aid project data set, we measure how many unique pieces of information are available about that aid project. So I mentioned this here because we actually in this paper used this index only very small, in a very small component, in a very limited way, because we look at cross national, so we have to aggregate it to the national level. But we think the data set provides some useful tools for kind of descriptive analysis and to really get fine-grained analysis. And if people have suggestions on things that we think we could do with it or are interested in collaborating with us on how to use that data, we'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. In addition to this data set, we also ran 3 survey experiments with the YouGov panel in August 2022. And so it was a panel here in the UK. And these are the survey experiments are what I'm mainly going to talk about here today. So I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. But here we were interested in measuring the effect of transparency on public opinion. And we have a sample of about 2,000 British citizens. So the main question that we're interested in this particular paper is, do citizens reward public institutions for increased transparency? And in particular, do citizens reward increased transparency on low information foreign policy issues, which we think foreign aid is a good example. So if aid agencies are more transparent, do citizens support them more? And which types of citizens are more influenced by transparency? So does transparency increase support amongst the most skeptical? So if you're really skeptical of government, or if you're really skeptical about aid, does transparency actually increase your support? Or is it just confirming your prior beliefs? So if you're already very supportive about aid and you find out that the agency is transparent, does it just kind of give you an extra boost, but it doesn't actually change the people that already have the more negative? What do we know about transparency? So there's a vast kind of discussion around transparency ranging from public administration and political science and the IR. So Hood has this, he says, well, transparency has attained a quasi-religious significance in theories of democratic governance. So if you read kind of the policy literature, but even some of the academic literature, transparency is supposed to do a lot, right? Transparency is really kind of this workhorse for doing all kinds of things around improving government accountability, citizen trust, affecting things around public opinion, and it has a lot of pressure that's placed upon it. Within IR, transparency is often assumed to be a source of legitimization and democratization for international organizations. So if international organizations are more transparent, it means that they're more democratic, it gives them more legitimacy in the eyes of global citizens. It's also theorized as a means of overcoming conflict and arriving at a more just global system. And the general kind of assumption here is that if you shine this light onto the actions of governments and the action of government officials, that transparency increases both government accountability and citizen And you see this kind of repeated in a variety of different forms. If you look at initiatives by the UK government, or by the US, or by the OECD DAC, but also in the academic literature. But if you delve a little bit deeper, what you also see is that there's a lot of debates about what transparency actually even means. So what I found also interesting is that across the kind of ontological spectrum, you have people who make a very similar critique that transparency is kind of overworked, and it means different things to different people. It's equated with things around corruption, or it's equated around citizen trust. And so it's conceptualized in very different ways, and it's often linked to very different outcomes. So things like higher levels of citizen participation, improved financial management, reduced corruption, right? And we actually lack a lot of empirical analysis, and particularly about the micro foundations of trust. So you have survey work, which often finds some type of correlation between transparency and citizen trust in particular. But the experimental stuff that's come out is actually questioning whether or not there's kind of too much being placed on transparency. And I think there's two pieces here in particular that are really interesting. So you have this piece by Grummerlich-Hausen, who he does an experiment where they're looking across, citizens were given different types of websites that have different degrees of information. And what he finds is that citizens' emotions and their preconceptions about government in general are more influential than how much information is provided. So transparency has an effect, but it doesn't have as much of an effect as these higher existing beliefs. And then you have this interesting piece by Mirnik, which is specifically looking within international security and covert actions. And she also similarly finds that the transparency, the publics only have a weak preference for transparency. So she has a sample in the US. And what she finds is that citizens actually have a stronger preference when it comes to foreign policy into what the actual foreign policy is, not whether or not it was covertly decided. So for us, all of this kind of suggests that we need to know more about the micro foundations of transparency and kind of how this actually affects citizens. Why do we think this is interesting to talk about in the context of foreign aid agencies? Well, what we wanted to really do is think about this in the context of a low information environment. And part of this is in some ways also driven by, well, where it might matter the most. So if citizens are not particularly informed on certain foreign policy issues, so it could be foreign aid or it could also be migration, and if transparency gives it a boost, it actually might be a very powerful tool by governments, right? So if they can be more transparent, it might be a way to increase popular support for topics that we might care about and we might want to advocate for, but citizens often have very little information on. We also think it's quite illustrative of the global movement towards transparency, or the kind of rise of transparency norms. So within aid transparency, the kind of push for aid transparency really started with the CRA, but then you had the establishment of the AITI and Publish What You Fund. And these timelines really map on to kind of more broader movements in transparency. So they also map onto the rise of new public management within government institutions. So it's also kind of reflective of these global trends. I won't go into this the second because I think people who wrote this are also in the room, but we know that citizens know very little about aid, right? So overall knowledge about aid giving is generally low, and support for aid relative to other spending priorities is low, right? So in these cases, right, if we have transparency, what will citizens actually support these agencies more? So I mentioned before in the very beginning that in the previous slide, that we think that transparency is a little bit overworked, right, in terms of the claim. Nevertheless, we're still predicting that transparency will have a positive effect. And the reason is that we think that that citizens should care about the effectiveness of government spending. So when transparency is greater, citizens can verify failure and corruption, and citizens in democracies should be socialized into these norms of government transparency, particularly at this point in time, and therefore they reward transparency. And we think that this should have a particularly pronounced effect when it comes to low information foreign policy issues for a couple of reasons. So if you have low information, then this decreases information about this policy area. and debates tend to be dominated by headline-grabbing failures. And I think you certainly see that with aid. I mean, if aid is in the newspaper, it's because there was something wrong, there was a corruption case, or there was a violation of human rights, right? So therefore, citizens are likely to have the impression that things are not working as they should, and that transparency is then useful to kind of shine a light on what actually needs done. And this lack of information can also give people the impression that government is not fulfilling its job to inform the people. So if I don't know about aid, it's because the government hasn't told me enough about it, right? And therefore, they may get a boost for being transparent, for being more transparent. So in concrete hypotheses, the first hypothesis is just that, in general, that transparency increases citizen support for foreign aid. And here the kind of A and B is because we have observational data and then we also have experimental. So we're measuring two different things here, right? So when we come to at the observational level, we're just looking at whether higher rates of transparency are correlated with higher levels of public opinion on foreign aid. Whereas in the experimental data, what the treatment is actually if citizens are told about the reforms that an agency is doing to be more transparent. Right? So it's important that the treatment is not that they're seeing more information about aid, but they're actually being told, here's what, in this case, the UK government is doing to improve transparency. So the first is this cross-national, and the second is this question of if more information on the transparency of aid agencies increases citizen support for the agency. And we think that because of this low information environment, that individuals that express lower degrees of trust in public institutions should respond more strongly to this information treatment. And that individuals that express high skepticism about the issue area, in this case, if they're skeptical of aid, should also respond more strongly to information on transparency. So this is the observational data. So what you're seeing here is a correlation between the CAD index. And so the CAD index is compiled from confirmatory factor analysis over the 19 main indicators of the index. And important is that these are country averages, right? So the CAD is, I think what's actually really nice about the data set is that it's at the agency level. We can't use that agency level in this because we're correlating it with public opinion at a national level. And the public opinion is simply a question from the Eurobarometer from 2016, which asked the European Union and its member states provide financial assistance. Which of the following statements best describes your opinion? So we should spend more money, we should continue to spend money as we do, or we should spend less money in support of developing countries. And what you see is this correlation. And for us, this was actually the inspiration to try to do these survey experiments because we found this correlation. We thought it would be interesting to see about the relationship, but then of course, this doesn't tell us anything about whether or not it's causal. So what we did is we then carried out these three experiments. I'm going to present two of the experiments today. So the first was a very simple monadic experiment in which the control had this kind of general statement, right? So the FCDO is the main UK aid agency. To what extent do you support aid given by this country? And then they were asked on a scale of 1 to 10, whether or how much support they provided or they had for the FCDO. The treatment, you'll see, as I mentioned, is about what the FCDO is actually doing to be more transparent. So it provides information on its website about ministers, undersecretaries, director generals. It uploads detailed information on its aid portfolio, and it includes data for individual projects. So we thought a pretty simple treatment, right? We're not telling anyone anything very complex, right? We're not telling them any kind of detailed information. So while we had predicted it had an effect, we were actually surprised that it actually had as strong an effect as it did. So we found that the information treatment correlates to a 12% increase, which for a very minor treatment we thought was quite interesting. And importantly, it's driven, as the graph here shows, it's really driven by those who are the most critical of aid and those that are the most critical of the civil service. So in addition to our experiments, we asked 3 questions about how much the citizens trusted the civil service. how much they trusted the government, and how much they supported foreign aid. And what we see is that what matters is whether or not they're aid skeptical or whether or not they're skeptical of the civil service. And interesting for me, that doesn't hold for trust in the government as a whole, which suggests to us that citizens are attributing foreign aid to the bureaucracy and not necessarily governments as a whole, which for me is a bit surprising. I wasn't sure that citizens would actually make that distinction. But it is, what we find is that it's really driven by those two groups within the sample. This is just a visualization of the trust in civil service. And so what you see is that as trust in the civil service increases, the positive benefits of transparency for aid support become weaker. The second was a conjoined experiment. So this is a bit more of a complicated experiment. So what we did is we ran, so the UK government provides around 12 billion pounds of taxpayer money as foreign aid each year, and 60% of that money is given through aid agencies of the UK government. These agencies face a number of choices on what information they disclose, and you see these types of information that they plan to disclose. And then whether or not there was a yes or no was randomized. And then they were asked at the end, please indicate on a scale from 1 to 10, to what extent you would support or oppose foreign aid given through agency 1 and agency 2. And so these are all reforms that have to do with transparency. It's just different types of transparency. And we also ran an experiment where we compared transparency to other types of reforms. But for this paper, we're using this conjoint. And what we find is that it doesn't actually matter. Citizens respond to transparency. An agency gets a boost if they're more transparent, but the citizens don't really care what type of information is provided, which I think for me, from a policy perspective, is also a bit sobering, right? It suggests that a development agency doesn't really, it doesn't really matter how critical they think about this, but they just have to show that they're being transparent and can provide information. And the citizens respond positively to that, regardless of kind of what that information is. And that's also shown by this. This is just the number of yeses in the conjoint. And so what you see is that after you have 2 yeses, so after an agency is more transparent on 2 or more, they get this boost from citizens. So what does this all mean for us and for kind of the takeaways? So we think that there's kind of 3 main takeaways from the paper and from the analysis. The first is that citizens value transparency, and this was, I mean, for us, we thought that this was going to be present, but we were also, in some ways, I mean, I think there's some positive and also sobering evidence from it, right? So we see that transparency is really rewarded by citizens, and it's particularly rewarded by skeptics, but citizens don't actually discriminate on the type of information. So it's more about, in some ways, about a public appearance, it suggests. I should say that I think a big limitation of the data is that we're just measuring an immediate effect. So we don't know whether this effect holds over the long term. We can't measure it in these experiments, but I think there's reasons to think that that effect will wane over time. So for you, I was also hoping we could reflect a little bit about any questions you might have, but also kind of this foreign aid as an illustrated case. If you have suggestions about ways to improve this, like, do you buy this argument that aid agencies are illustrative of public institutions, or is it something very specific about aid agencies or things? And in general, how we can make it a little bit more compelling or less obvious. I mean, the results kind of say, well, transparency matters, right? And I think you can also read it as, well, that was obvious. We should have expected that it could happen. And I don't actually think that the discussion or the debate sets it up and that that's actually true. But I think when you read through the paper, there is a bit of sense when you had people to read it, that it seems a bit like, yeah, well, of course you found this, right? And so if you have suggestions on the framing and things, you would appreciate that. So that's it for me.